This video is for teachers who are looking for an overview of Day 6 of Unit 1 in the Passport to Social Studies curriculum. The focus question of which is how did the land-owning whites in the Virginia colony construct the institution of slavery in British North America to ensure their wealth, with the objective of students being able to trace how the competition for land, a desire to exploit natural resources, and the demand for labor led to the development of a race-based chattel system of slavery in colonial Virginia. Additionally, as this lesson includes modeling of the second step of the Turning Points tool, which is an integral component of this unit, I will also discuss some approaches you might take as you model and guide your students through it. There are separate videos for steps 1 and 3 of this tool. Steps 4 and 5 are combined into one. Each of these videos uses unique sources from the individual lessons. However, the methods and procedures are applicable regardless of the content or event being evaluated as a turning point. The event under consideration in this lesson is the development of race-based chattel slavery. Before getting started, as might be the case with several lessons in this unit, students may find the content distressing or upsetting. However, it is still important that we study these events and critically read the related sources. In this Note to Teachers slide, links are shared to Facing History and Ourselves, as well as Teaching Tolerance. And these are two sites that do provide strategies and ideas on how to address this. One last thing to consider is what it says right here about how we still use our virtual classroom as a space for students to express their discomfort and feelings of anger or distress that may emerge from learning about these topics in history. The first part of this lesson begins with students watching this brief video featuring Professor Ibram X. Kendi, followed up by reading the secondary source, Making Slavery Legal in the 17th Century. After which, the students then participate in this 5-3-1 activity that really allows them to reflect on the big ideas and their reactions to what these two sources discussed. I know that here in the directions, it does call for the students to do this independently, but if you happen to be doing this synchronously and would like to promote some student-to-student discussion, you can adapt it like this. Still have the students identify their top 5 most important understandings independently and have them enter it here in the leftmost column. Then arrange the students into pairs and place them in breakout rooms and instruct them to share each of their 5 understandings with each other, and then discuss and reach consensus on which 3 out of their now 10 are the most impactful or relevant, which they will then record here in this middle column. Then, after bringing the students back to the main session, inform them that they and their partners will now be combined with another pair, and together they will now share their 3 understandings each, bringing the total to 6. The group of 4 then discusses and narrows it down to which they believe is the single most relevant or important understanding from this, which all 4 of them will record here in the rightmost column. I find doing this 5-3-1 activity like this to be more effective at not only promoting student discussion and honing their speaking, listening, and compromising skills, but also allows them to see multiple viewpoints and different interpretations. Also, just a piece of logistical advice, I found that the easiest way to keep all this straight is to combine the odd number breakout rooms with the even ones directly below it. For instance, add the 2 students from breakout room 2 to breakout room 1, and the pair in room 4, add them to room 3, and so on. To continue the process of building their content knowledge required for steps 1 and 2 of the Turning Points tool, the students will now independently read and analyze these 2 sources, Court Ruling on Anthony Johnson and His Servant and Virginia's Slave Laws, for which there are 2 prompts down here that can be used to check their understanding of both texts. Before actually having them begin step 2 though, you should provide them with an overview of it, how it draws on their findings from step 1, and how it sets up those that follow. For convenience, I'm going to switch over to the paper version that appears as a PDF just for this broad overview. We can see here that step 2 calls for students to identify defining characteristics of the proposed turning point. My own students, though, did need a little assistance as to what defining means in this sense. After providing the class with the definition, I engaged them in this line of inquiry. First, I asked, what could an example be of a defining characteristic of an individual? And then I called on student volunteers to share out. Then I asked, what could an example be of a defining characteristic of a society? And then again, I called on volunteers to share. Then, the third and final time I asked the question, I made it about a defining moment of a specific event that we recently just discussed and I knew was fresh in their minds, such as the impact on Indigenous people due to English colonization. I found this process of having the students start by making a personal connection, then growing it outwards to the scale needed for this step to be pretty effective at reinforcing what defining means in this sense. On the second page of the tool, we can see the chart showing the different categories of these defining characteristics, and after reviewing the definitions of each, you might ask for student volunteers to apply their knowledge of defining characteristics and ask for hypothetical examples for each of these five. To check their understanding before moving forward, you might even provide your own general ones and ask the class to classify them. For instance, you might say something like the peaceful transfer of power to a newly elected president, which they would ideally classify as political. Really, the purpose is just to ensure that they know what to look for as they reread their sources and then discern where their findings belong. After providing this overview and the students have a pretty good idea of what to expect, they should now be prepared to undertake the first two steps of evaluating this event, the development of race-based chattel slavery, as a turning point. Since they already have seen step one modeled in a previous lesson and had the opportunity to work on it independently, the students should be fairly familiar with this process. However, if their previously completed work indicates to you that some students may require some reteaching or clarification of this, you can opt to divide the class and have some students attempt it independently while you work with those needing support. Depending on your class dynamics, another option is to strategically pair students up as they go through this first step. You might also consider ending this segment by providing them with a teacher-made exemplar for them to compare their responses to and note any similarities and differences, as well as their personal progress. Once they have established the context for the event in question, the next thing to do is to model step two with them. Even though it is not explicitly written into this step, stress to students the importance of having questions ahead of time that will guide them through this part and help them hone in on what is truly relevant to determining whether it's a defining moment. To help them with this, they should rely on what they learned from the contextualization they just did in step one. To assist with this, here are some sample questions for the economic defining moments that should guide student thinking as they review or reread their sources. If you are modeling this step with a think aloud to your synchronous students, here's one way you can alter the slide to provide them with some visual reinforcement of your process. If you want your students to see you start off with a blank step two, just like they will be doing when they do it independently, you could choose to animate this bubble so it appears when you are verbally describing that part of the process. To do this, all you need to do is right-click on the bubble and then click Animate. Another option is to make multiple copies of this slide and modify the duplicates to provide additional visual support. For instance, I wanted my students to see how the entry directly addressed the questions that were asked. So I made a slide where both appear side by side, which really assists my students who are very visual learners. Also, as you are doing your verbal modeling, make sure you indicate where the information in this entry originates from, whether it is from prior knowledge pulled from previous lesson, like days 3 and 5, or if it was garnered from sources that were part of this lesson. For example, here's the secondary source from this lesson, and you can see that I annotated it using a color scheme based on those 5 defining characteristics, which is something you may encourage your own students to do. If you do decide to do this, you can show the students how this passage right over here regarding an economic defining moment actually was incorporated into the entry over here in the sample. Since this is a model, you may determine that your students may benefit from seeing another category, one that more clearly relies on information provided in this lesson. If you were to do this, consider modeling political defining moments. You can either provide your own questions made ahead of time, do a think aloud as you create them with the class, or call on students to volunteer their own. Then, refer students back to that secondary source we looked at a moment ago and clearly demonstrate where you found relevant answers and show them how they helped you create an entry similar to this. At this point, the student should then be able to complete the rest of this table independently, which should be used as a check for understanding. Lastly, there are 2 wrap-up questions, the first of which asks students to apply the content from this lesson to answer the focus question, and the second is more related to the skills of evaluating turning points.